April 16, 1945. A military transport truck rolled through the pine forests of southern Georgia, carrying 23 German women toward an uncertain future. Inside the canvas-covered vehicle, Greta Hoffmann pressed her face against the small opening, watching American soil pass by for the first time. The landscape was nothing like she had imagined. Instead of the cold, industrial wasteland her Wehrmacht instructors had described, she saw green fields, blooming dogwood trees, and wooden farmhouses that reminded her painfully of Bavaria. She was 22 years old, a former communications auxiliary captured 3 months earlier in Belgium, and she had no idea what awaited her in American captivity. The truck lurched to a stop outside a modest compound, surrounded by chain-link fencing and wooden watchtowers. Armed guards stood at attention, but their postures seemed almost casual compared to the rigid military bearing Greta had known in German camps. As the women climbed down from the transport, their worn gray auxiliary uniforms marking them as enemy combatants, they were met not with hostility, but with something more unsettling: curious, almost sympathetic stares. Colonel Richard Pemberton, the camp commandant, stood on the administration building steps watching the new arrivals. He had overseen male German prisoners before, but this was his first group of women POWs. He had received strict instructions from Washington about their treatment. They were to be housed separately, given adequate facilities, and treated in accordance with Geneva Convention standards. What concerned him most was not security, but something more fundamental. How do you maintain military discipline while showing basic human decency to young women who had been taught you were their mortal enemy? The processing took 2 hours. Names were recorded, photographs taken, and identification numbers assigned. Through it all, Greta remained silent, answering questions, halting English when required but offering nothing more. Beside her stood Elsa Braun, a former Wehrmacht nurse who had become Greta's closest companion during their Atlantic crossing. Elsa's face was pale, her hands trembling slightly as she clutched a small canvas bag containing her only possessions. By the time processing finished, evening had fallen. The women were led to their barracks, a simple wooden structure with rows of metal cots. But before they could collapse onto those beds, they were directed to the mess hall for their first meal as prisoners on American soil. The building was warm, lit by bare bulbs hanging from the ceiling, and filled with the most unexpected thing: the smell of food. Real food. Not the thin gruel or stale bread they had survived on during transport, but something rich and almost overwhelmingly aromatic. Greta entered the mess hall with the others, their boots echoing on the wooden floor. Behind a long serving counter stood a tall American soldier in a precept white apron, his dark skin glistening with perspiration from the kitchen heat. Sergeant Henry Crawford had been cooking since dawn, preparing what he considered a proper welcome meal. He looked at the exhausted, suspicious faces of the German women and felt something unexpected, not anger at enemies, but concern for hungry human beings. Greta stood in the serving line, watching as the American cook began filling metal trays with food. The other women shuffled forward silently, their eyes fixed on the steaming containers behind the counter. It had been so long since any of them had seen this much food in one place. During the final months in Europe, their rations had dwindled to almost nothing. A slice of black bread, perhaps a thin soup made from potato peels. The retreat through Belgium had been chaos, and food had become a distant memory, something you dreamed about but never expected to see again. When Greta reached the front of the line, Sergeant Crawford looked down at her with an expression she could not quite read. Not hatred, certainly, not even suspicion. Something closer to determination, as if feeding her properly was a personal mission he had accepted. He ladled a large spoonful of something pale and creamy onto her tray, then added a piece of fried chicken, some green beans, and a square of cornbread. The portions were generous, almost shocking in their abundance. Greta stared at her tray, particularly at the strange pale substance that dominated one section. It looked somewhat like porridge, but thicker, with an odd yellowish-white color. Steam rose from its surface, and small pools of melted butter glistened on top. She had never seen anything like it in her life. In Germany, they ate potatoes, sauerkraut, dumplings, sausages. This looked like nothing from her homeland. Crawford noticed her confusion. He pointed at the mysterious food and said slowly, clearly, "Grits. Corn grits. It's good. You'll like it." His accent was thick, the words drawling, in a way that made them almost melodic. Greta understood perhaps half of what he said, but the gesture was clear. This was food. She was meant to eat it. She carried her tray to a long wooden table where Elsa and several other women had already gathered. They sat in silence, examining their meals with a mixture of hunger and suspicion. Rosa Zimmerman, a sharp-featured woman in her late 20s who had already established herself as the group's skeptic, spoke first in German. "What is this white paste? It looks like something you would use to repair walls." Hilda Keller, the youngest at just 18 years old, poked at the grits with her fork. "Maybe it's some kind of punishment food. Something they feed to prisoners because it costs nothing." Her voice cracked slightly. She had been crying earlier, clutching a photograph of her family that she had somehow managed to keep hidden during processing. But hunger is a powerful force that overcomes suspicion. One by one, the women began to eat. Greta lifted a small spoonful of the grits to her mouth, expecting something bland or possibly bitter. What she tasted instead surprised her completely. It was warm, smooth, slightly sweet from the butter, with a subtle corn flavor that was entirely foreign yet somehow comforting. It was not delicious in the way German food was delicious, but it was substantial and warm and filling. Around the mess hall, similar discoveries were happening at every table. The women ate quickly at first, driven by weeks of near starvation. Then more slowly, as their stomachs began to remember what fullness felt like. The fried chicken was crispy and seasoned with spices they did not recognize. The cornbread was dense and slightly sweet. And the grits, strange as they were, filled a hunger that went deeper than physical need. Greta woke the next morning to sunlight streaming through the barracks windows and the unfamiliar sound of American voices calling morning roll. Her stomach felt strange, full, in a way it had not been for months. The previous night's meal had been so substantial that some of the women had actually felt sick afterward, their bodies no longer accustomed to proper portions. She dressed slowly in the clean prison uniform that had been provided, plain gray cotton that was worn but carefully mended. It was better quality than the threadbare auxiliary uniform she had arrived in. Breakfast was served at 0700 hours. The women filed into the mess hall again, this time with slightly less apprehension. They knew what to expect now, or at least they thought they did. Sergeant Crawford stood behind his serving counter once more, this time offering scrambled eggs, bacon, toast, and those same mysterious grits. The grits appeared at every meal, Greta would soon learn. They were apparently as essential to Southern American cooking as potatoes were to German cuisine. Lieutenant Sarah Matthews entered the mess hall during breakfast, clipboard in hand. She was a slender woman in her early 30s with intelligent gray eyes and light brown hair pinned neatly beneath her service cap. She had been assigned to oversee the welfare of female prisoners, a role that was still relatively new in the American military structure. Most POW camps held only men, and the arrival of German women had created administrative challenges that no one had quite prepared for. Matthews walked between the tables, observing the prisoners as they ate. She noticed how they still clustered together, speaking only German among themselves, their eyes downcast whenever an American guard passed nearby. She understood their fear and confusion. These young women had been taught that Americans were brutal enemies who showed no mercy. Yet here they were, being fed generous portions of food and housed in barracks that, while simple, were clean and reasonably comfortable. The cognitive dissonance must be overwhelming. After breakfast, the prisoners were assembled in the compound and yard for orientation. Colonel Pemberton addressed them through Lieutenant Matthews, who spoke functional German. The rules were explained. Work assignments would begin tomorrow. Letters could be written home once per month under supervision. Recreation time would be provided each evening, and cooperation with camp authorities was expected but not compulsory. The Geneva Convention protected them from forced labor on military projects, but they could volunteer for kitchen duty, laundry, or maintenance work. When the orientation ended, Greta found herself standing near the mess hall, watching through the screen door as Sergeant Crawford cleaned his kitchen. He moved with practiced efficiency, scrubbing large pots and organizing supplies for the next meal. He began humming something, a low melodic tune that drifted out into the warm Georgia morning. The sound was so incongruous with everything Greta had expected from this place that she found herself drawn closer to listen. Crawford noticed her shadow at the door. He looked up and smiled, a genuine expression that reached his eyes. "You like the grits?" he asked in his slow, careful English. He made an exaggerated gesture of eating, then rubbed his stomach and smiled wider. "Good food, yes?" Greta understood the question, if not all the words. She hesitated, then nodded slowly. Yes. Good." The words felt strange in her mouth, this acknowledgement to an enemy that he had fed her well. But it was true. The food had been good, better than good. It had been prepared with care, served with something that looked almost like pride. 3 days after their arrival, work assignments were posted. Greta found her name listed for kitchen duty alongside Elsa and 2 other women. Rosa Zimmerman had protested loudly in German that working in the enemy's kitchen was beneath their dignity, but Greta felt differently. The mess hall was warm, the work would be indoors, and perhaps most importantly, it meant regular access to food. After months of hunger, that consideration outweighed any concerns about pride. Sergeant Crawford greeted his new assistants with characteristic patience. He had requested female prisoners for kitchen work specifically, believing that the familiar domestic task might ease their transition into camp life. He also suspected that cooking together might provide opportunities for communication that formal interrogations never could. Not that he was interested in intelligence gathering. Crawford's concerns were simpler and more immediate. He wanted to feed people properly, and he needed help doing it. The first morning was awkward and silent. Crawford demonstrated tasks through gestures and simple words. Greta watched as he showed them how to measure ingredients, how to work the industrial stoves, how to prepare vegetables in the quantities needed to feed over 200 people. The scale of American abundance was staggering. Sacks of flour and cornmeal lined the storage room walls. Crates of fresh eggs arrived weekly. Meat was rationed, but still more plentiful than anything Greta had seen in Germany for years. The grits fascinated her most of all. Crawford stored them in large burlap sacks, the dried corn kernels ground into coarse white granules. He showed her the proper ratio of water to grits, the importance of constant stirring to prevent lumps, the exact amount of salt and butter needed. "My mama taught me this," he said slowly, stirring the large pot with a wooden paddle. "Her mama taught her. Goes back generations. Soul food. Understand? Food for the soul." Greta did not understand all his words, but she understood his tone. This was not just sustenance. This was tradition, family, identity. Just as her own mother's sauerbraten recipe had been passed down through generations, these grits carried history and meaning beyond simple nutrition. She found herself nodding, and Crawford's face broke into a wide smile. By the end of the first week, a routine had established itself. Greta arrived at the kitchen each morning at 05:30 hours. Crawford would already be there, coffee brewing, the day's menu planned. He began teaching her English through cooking terms: pot, spoon, stir, hot, careful. Simple words, repeated patiently until they became familiar. Elsa joined in the lessons, her nursing background making her naturally comfortable with learning and instruction. The other prisoners noticed the change in Greta and Elsa. They returned from kitchen duty less tense, occasionally smiling, speaking scattered English words. Rosa continued to disapprove, but even she could not deny that the kitchen workers seemed more settled, less frightened than the rest of them. And the food continued to appear, meal after meal, those mysterious grits showing up like clockwork, becoming slowly, inexplicably familiar. By mid-May, the kitchen had become an unexpected bridge between two worlds. Greta's English improved daily, moving beyond simple nouns to basic sentences. "The water is boiling. We need more salt. This tastes good." Crawford responded by teaching her southern idioms that made no literal sense but somehow captured feelings perfectly. Happier than a dead pig in sunshine meant extremely happy. Fixin' to meant about to do something. The language was colorful and strange, and utterly different from the formal English she had learned in German schools. Lieutenant Matthews had begun joining them during morning preparation, ostensibly to check on prisoner welfare, but increasingly to participate in the informal language exchanges. She taught German phrases to Crawford and the guards while learning basic German herself. The kitchen filled with laughter when Crawford attempted to pronounce Guten Morgen with his thick South Carolina accent, or when Greta tried to wrap her tongue around the phrase, "Y'all come back now." The breakthrough came during the preparation of Sunday dinner in late May. Crawford had decided to make something special, a traditional Southern feast complete with fried chicken, collard greens, black-eyed peas, cornbread, and of course, creamy cheese grits. He wanted to show the German women what real American cooking looked like when you put effort into it. Greta watched as he added sharp cheddar cheese to the grits, stirring until it melted into golden smoothness, then finishing with butter and a crack of black pepper. "Taste this," Crawford said, offering Greta a spoonful. She hesitated only a moment before accepting. The cheese grits were rich and savory, completely different from the simple buttered version she had grown accustomed to. Her eyes widened with genuine surprise and pleasure. "This is very good," she said in careful English. "In Germany, we do not have this food. But it is comfort. Yes? Comfort food?" Crawford beamed with pride. "That's exactly right. Comfort food. Food that makes you feel like somebody cares about you." He paused, then added more softly, "Because somebody does care, you understand? You're people, not just prisoners, people." The words hung in the warm kitchen air. Elsa, who had been chopping vegetables nearby, stopped working. Even Private O'Brien, who had been delivering supplies, stood still. Greta felt something crack inside her chest, some wall she had carefully constructed since her capture. These Americans were supposed to hate her. She was their enemy, representing a country that had brought terrible destruction to the world. Yet here was this man, patiently teaching her his family's recipes, treating her with a kindness she had not experienced since leaving home. That evening's meal was served with unusual ceremony. Crawford had arranged the food with care, and the prisoners noticed. The cheese grits were creamy perfection, the chicken was crispy and hot. For the first time since their arrival, the German women did not eat in tense silence. Conversations began tentatively in mixed German and English. Hilda Keller actually laughed at something Private O'Brien said, then looked shocked at her own response. Something fundamental had shifted in the compound that day. June brought news that shattered the fragile peace growing within the camp. The International Red Cross had finally established communication channels with occupied Germany, and letters began arriving for the prisoners. Not many letters. Most families remained unreachable in the chaos of defeat and occupation, but enough arrived to paint a devastating picture of what the women would be returning to when their imprisonment ended. Greta received her letter on a Thursday morning. She was in the kitchen preparing breakfast when Lieutenant Matthews found her, envelope in hand. The address was written in her mother's familiar handwriting, but the paper was thin and dirty, clearly having traveled through multiple damaged postal systems. Greta's hands shook as she opened it. The letter was short, just one page, written in cramped script that suggested paper was precious. Her father was dead, killed in an Allied bombing raid on Munich 6 months earlier. Their home was destroyed. Her brother Klaus, who had been fighting on the Eastern Front, was missing and presumed dead. Her mother was living in a displaced persons camp outside the city ruins, surviving on Red Cross rations. The letter ended with a question that cut deeper than any of the tragic news. "When you come home, where will home be?" Greta stood motionless in the kitchen, letter clutched in her hand, tears streaming silently down her face. Crawford noticed immediately. He wiped his hands on his apron and approached carefully, concern evident in his expression. He could not read German, but he understood grief in any language. "Bad news from home?" he asked gently. She nodded, unable to speak. Elsa appeared at her side, having received her own letter with similarly devastating contents. Her fiancé had been killed at Stalingrad. Her parents' bakery, Hamburg, was rubble. She had no home to return to, no family waiting for her arrival. The two women stood together in the kitchen, surrounded by the warmth and abundance of American plenty, while their world across the ocean lay in ashes. Crawford did something then that surprised everyone, including himself. He pulled both women into a brief, awkward embrace. It violated military protocol and probably a dozen regulations about fraternization with enemy prisoners. But in that moment, he was not a sergeant, and they were not prisoners. They were simply human beings confronting unbearable loss. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I'm real sorry for your losses." That evening, Crawford made Greta's favorite version of grits, the cheese grits that had sparked their first real conversation. He served her portion himself, meeting her eyes with an expression of profound sympathy. She ate slowly, mechanically, the comfort food, providing physical warmth, if not emotional peace. Around the mess hall, other women who had received letters sat in similar states of shock and grief. The camp felt different that night. The cheerful progress toward mutual understanding had been confronted with harsh reality. These women were not simply prisoners learning to appreciate their captor's kindness. They were displaced persons facing the complete destruction of everything they had known. The grits, the laughter, the English lessons suddenly seemed almost frivolous against the magnitude of what they had lost. Yet somehow, inexplicably, those small gestures of humanity mattered more than ever. Summer transformed the Georgia landscape into a wall of heat and humidity that the German women found almost unbearable. But with the heat came opportunity. Colonel Pemberton had approved a Victory Garden project, allowing prisoners to cultivate vegetables on unused land behind the barracks. The garden served multiple purposes, supplementing camp food supplies, providing purposeful activity, and teaching agricultural skills that might prove useful when the women eventually returned to a Germany that would need to feed itself from ruins. Greta volunteered immediately. Working with soil reminded her of childhood summers at her grandmother's farm outside Munich, back when the world made sense and the future seemed predictable. She found herself assigned to the corn section, which seemed appropriate given her newfound relationship with America's most essential crop. Crawford had explained that grits came from corn, though the process of transforming those tall green stalks into the creamy breakfast staple remained somewhat mysterious to her. One Saturday morning, Crawford surprised everyone by appearing at the garden with several burlap sacks. "Y'all want to learn how grits really get made?" he asked. "From corn to table? It's hard work, but I figure you might appreciate knowing the whole story." Lieutenant Matthews had approved the educational project, seeing it as valuable cultural exchange. More importantly, she recognized that the German women needed purpose and connection to replace what they had lost. Crawford had arranged for dried corn from the previous year's harvest. He showed them how to remove the kernels from the cobs, then demonstrated the grinding process using a hand mill he had borrowed from a local farm. The work was exhausting in the summer heat. The women took turns cranking the mill handle, watching as whole kernels were crushed into progressively finer granules. Coarse grits, medium grits, fine grits, each requiring different grinding times and techniques. "My great-grandmother was enslaved on a plantation in South Carolina," Crawford said quietly as they worked. The German women did not fully understand the English word enslaved, so Lieutenant Matthews translated carefully. "She ground corn like this every day, fed the plantation owners, fed the field workers, fed her own family when she could. This food carries a lot of history, pain, and survival mixed together." Greta paused in her grinding, struck by the weight of what he was sharing. She had begun to understand that American history was far more complicated than German propaganda had suggested. These people had their own stories of suffering and resilience, their own complicated relationship with justice and injustice. The grits were not just Southern tradition. They were survival food created by people who had endured unimaginable hardship. By afternoon, they had produced nearly 10 pounds of grits from their labor. Crawford cooked a portion immediately, adding nothing but water and salt, letting the pure corn flavor speak for itself. The women tasted their own handiwork, understanding for the first time the complete journey from seed to sustenance. Elsa spoke what others were thinking. "We thought American food was strange. Now we understand it is just different. Different history, different meaning, but same purpose. To nourish, to sustain, to connect people together." Crawford smiled broadly. "Now you're getting it." July 4, 1945. American Independence Day arrived with special significance that year. The war in Europe had ended 2 months earlier. Japan still fought in the Pacific, but victory seemed inevitable. For the first time in years, Americans could celebrate their independence without the shadow of immediate threat hanging over them. Colonel Pemberton decided that camp should mark the occasion with a special meal and limited festivities, including the German prisoners and the celebration as a gesture of reconciliation. Crawford had been planning the menu for weeks. This would be his masterpiece. A meal that represented the best of Southern cooking and American abundance. Fried chicken, pulled pork barbecue, potato salad, coleslaw, baked beans, cornbread, biscuits, peach cobbler, and of course, his signature cheese grits. But he had something else in mind, something unprecedented. He approached Lieutenant Matthews with a proposal that made her pause. "What if we let the German women cook some of their own food too?" he suggested. "Make it a real shared meal. They got their traditions, we got ours. Seems like Independence Day might be a good time to show that different folks can sit down together." Matthews brought the idea to Colonel Pemberton, who deliberated for 2 days before approving it with strict conditions. The German women could prepare traditional dishes using provided ingredients under constant supervision, and the meal would be framed as an educational cultural exchange. Greta and Elsa worked alongside Crawford in the kitchen during the days leading up to the celebration. They taught him how to make sauerbraten, though they had to substitute ingredients and simplify the traditional week-long marination process. Rosa Zimmermann, who had gradually softened her hostile stance, showed them how to prepare Kartoffelsalat, German potato salad with vinegar and bacon. Hilde Keller contributed a simple apple strudel recipe her mother had taught her. The day of the feast arrived with clear skies and oppressive heat. Tables were arranged outside under shade trees, creating an almost festive atmosphere that seemed impossible just months earlier. American soldiers and German prisoners worked together setting up, their conversations now flowing in mixed English and German that both sides had learned to navigate. Private O'Brien joked with Hilda in broken German, while Corporal Brown, the once skeptical Georgia native, helped Rosa carry heavy serving dishes. When the meal was served, the tables held an extraordinary sight. American and German foods, side by side, representing two nations that had been locked in brutal conflict. Crawford stood to address the gathering, with Lieutenant Matthews translating, "Today we celebrate American independence. But we also celebrate something else. The independence every person has to choose who they want to be. These women were our enemies. We were theirs. But we chose different. We chose to see each other as human beings. That's what real independence is. The freedom to choose kindness over hatred." Greta felt tears welling as she listened. The cheese grits sat beside her mother's sauerbraten recipe, American cornbread next to German potato salad. The message was clear and profound. Different worlds could share the same table. Former enemies could break bread together. August brought official notification that repatriation procedures would begin in September. The German women prisoners would be processed through displaced persons camps in occupied Germany before being released to rebuild their lives in whatever remained of their homeland. The announcement should have been welcome news, the promise of freedom after months of captivity. Instead, it created profound anxiety throughout the compound. Greta sat in the mess hall late one evening, long after dinner service had ended. Crawford found her there, staring at an empty coffee cup. He sat down across from her without asking permission, a gesture that had become comfortable between them over the months. "You worried about going home?" he asked quietly. She nodded slowly, searching for English words adequate to express her confusion. "Home is gone, family is gone, Germany is. I do not know what Germany is now. Here, I have work. I have purpose. I have friends." She gestured around the kitchen. "There, I will have nothing. And people will hate me because I was captured, because I stayed in America so long, because I learned to see Americans as human beings instead of enemies." Crawford was quiet for a long moment. "You know," he finally said, "after this war ends, I'm planning to go back to South Carolina and open a restaurant. Real Southern cooking. Done right. I'm gonna need good people who understand food isn't just about eating, it's about connection and caring and making folks feel welcomed." He paused meaningfully. There are ways for people to stay in America if they got sponsors and good reasons. Greta looked up sharply, hope and fear warring in her expression. You would do this? Sponsor enemy prisoner to stay in your country? People would be angry. They would say you are traitor. People will say lots of things, Crawford replied calmly. But I know what I've seen these past months. You're not my enemy. You're a good person who got caught up in bad circumstances. You deserve a chance to build something new. He stood up, then added, You think about it. Talk to Lieutenant Matthews. There's procedures, lots of paperwork, but it's possible, if it's what you want. Over the following weeks, quiet conversations spread through the prisoner population. Lieutenant Matthews had begun investigating immigration procedures for German POWs who wished to remain in the United States. The process was complicated, requiring civilian sponsors, proof of good character, and approval from multiple government agencies. But it was possible. Several local families, including Mrs. Ruth Patterson's church congregation, had expressed willingness to sponsor prisoners they had come to know through the outreach program. Elsa approached Greta one evening as they prepared the next morning's grits. Captain Hayes says he can help me get nursing certification if I stay. Says American hospitals need good nurses, and my experience counts for something. Her voice was tentative, seeking reassurance. Is it wrong to want to stay? Does it make us cowards who are running away from responsibility? Greta thought about Crawford's words, about the difference between running away and choosing to move forward. I think, she said carefully, we have the right to choose where we can do the most good, where we can become who we want to be. 20 years later, spring 1965. Greta Hoffman Crawford stood in the kitchen of her restaurant in Charleston, South Carolina, watching the morning sun stream through windows that overlooked a bustling street. The sign outside read, Crawford's Table, Southern and European Cuisine. And inside, the breakfast crowd was already gathering. She stirred a large pot of cheese grits with the same wooden paddle Henry had used at the camp, now worn smooth by 2 decades of daily use. Her path from German prisoner to American citizen and restaurant co-owner had been long and complicated. The sponsorship process had taken 8 months of paperwork, interviews, and bureaucratic delays. She had faced hostility from some Americans who could not forget that she had worn a German uniform. But she had also found unexpected support from people who believed in second chances and the possibility of redemption. Henry Crawford had kept his promise, sponsoring her immigration and eventually proposing marriage 3 years after the war ended. Elsa had followed a different path. She had completed her nursing certification and spent 15 years working at Charleston General Hospital, before returning to Germany in 1960 to help train nurses in the rebuilding nation. She wrote regularly, her letters describing a country transformed, dedicated to confronting its past and building a democratic future. She had finally made peace with both worlds, able to embrace her German identity while carrying American values of compassion and service. Of the original 23 women who had arrived at that Georgia camp, 9 had remained in America permanently. The others had returned to Germany, most successfully rebuilding their lives despite the challenges. Rosa Zimmermann had become a teacher in Munich, using her experience to educate young Germans about the importance of questioning authority and thinking independently. Hilda Keller had married an American soldier she met during the occupation and now lived in Ohio with 4 children who spoke both German and English. At Crawford's table, the menu reflected Greta's journey. Cheese grits appeared alongside. Kartoffel salad. Fried chicken shared the menu with schnitzel. Customers came for the unique fusion of cultures, but they stayed for the warmth that infused every dish. Greta had learned from Henry that food was more than sustenance. It was communication, tradition, love, and hope served on a plate. She thought often about that first meal in the prison camp mess hall, staring at a mysterious white substance she did not recognize. Those grits had represented everything foreign and frightening about America. Now they represented home, comfort, and the family she had built from ashes. The irony was not lost on her. She had crossed an ocean as an enemy prisoner, and found herself through the simple act of learning to appreciate a bowl of creamy corn grits, prepared by a man who chose kindness over hatred. Henry entered the kitchen, older now but still moving with purpose. He kissed her cheek and began preparing his grandmother's biscuit recipe. They worked in comfortable silence, the rhythm of long partnership guiding their movements. Outside, customers waited. Inside, two former enemies created something neither could have imagined during those dark days of war. They created peace, one meal at a time.